The year was 1922, and in the quiet outskirts of northern England, a modest brick building had opened its doors to children in need. St. Agatha Orphanage, as it was officially called, was founded by a consortium of local philanthropists, claiming to offer shelter, education, and care to children abandoned by circumstance. What greeted the public, however, was a meticulously curated facade, a veneer of warmth and nurturing that belied the harsh reality within. Our investigation begins with the earliest surviving records of the orphanage, archived letters from the founding trustees, and testimonies collected from former residents. The facility, sprawling across 3 acres, contained dormitories, a small chapel, and classrooms where children were expected to maintain strict schedules of study and labor. While contemporary newspaper accounts lauded the orphanage as a model institution, internal correspondence reveals a troubling pattern. Children were frequently sent away to labor in private households or factories, sometimes for years at a time, with minimal documentation. In 1924, a series of letters between the headmistress, Margaret Whitmore, and a regional council official reveal the first recorded disappearance. A boy named Thomas Hargreaves, 10 years old, was reported missing after being assigned to a nearby textile mill. The official report simply noted he had run away, yet subsequent records indicate he was never found. The language used in these letters, polite and bureaucratic, masks an underlying tension, a concern that such disappearances could attract scrutiny if investigated further. Interviews conducted with former staff in the late 1970s suggest a chilling indifference. Several recall hearing whispers among colleagues that children vanished as if swallowed by the building itself. By 1930, the orphanage had expanded to accommodate nearly 90 children, yet the proportion of missing children had increased. Archival photographs from this period show rows of children lined up for daily inspections, expressions neutral or fearful, some with eyes cast downward, others glaring directly at the camera. The faces are hauntingly familiar, and yet none can be traced to surviving records outside the orphanage's own files. In 1935, a fire broke out in one of the dormitories, resulting in injuries to several children. While local newspapers framed the incident as a tragic accident, confidential letters recovered decades later depict a more sinister narrative. Staff members expressed concern that the fire had conveniently eliminated certain troublesome individuals and praised Whitmore for maintaining control, suggesting that the danger to children's lives was subordinate to the reputation of the institution. Our team gained access to a set of journals maintained by Whitmore herself, which remained hidden in the archives until 1995. These journals reveal a mind obsessed with order, obedience, and secrecy. In one entry, dated March 17, 1941, Whitmore writes, "The smallest transgression cannot be tolerated. The building must remain whole, and any disruption removed before it spreads." The wording, clinical yet menacing, implies a system where missing children were neither accidents nor escapees, but deliberate omissions. During World War II, the orphanage's location on the northern outskirts shielded it from direct bombing, but government documents indicate that St. Agatha's was briefly considered for evacuation under child safety regulations. Correspondence between Whitmore and the Ministry of Education, however, reveals that she resisted relocation, citing the logistical challenges and potential disruption to the children's discipline. Within this period, the orphanage's records show at least 12 children disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Archival investigations have traced these children's names to no subsequent school, hospital, or census records, suggesting they never existed beyond the orphanage's walls once removed. Former residents who survived into adulthood recount a culture of silence. Questions were forbidden, punishments were severe, and any mention of children who had disappeared was met with hostility or denial. One survivor, interviewed in 1976, described the dormitory as a room where shadows moved at the edge of your vision, and the night had teeth. She recalls waking to empty beds and being told they went to better homes. a phrase repeated so often that its repetition became automatic, masking fear with routine. The first systematic inquiry into these disappearances occurred in 1951, when local authorities were prompted by a letter from a distant relative seeking information about a child sent to the orphanage in 1939. Inspection reports describe missing records, deliberate obfuscation, and inconsistencies in official documentation. Despite these findings, no prosecutions occurred, and Whitmore continued her administration until her retirement in 1965. Interviews with surviving staff members suggest that while some children were indeed placed in external foster homes or labor arrangements, a significant number simply vanished, leaving rooms empty and files blank. The reasons for these vanishings remain elusive, obscured by decades of intentional secrecy, bureaucratic oversight, and the passage of time. In 1968, a local journalist uncovered a series of photographs depicting children standing outside the orphanage, but the images contained subtle anomalies. Children's positions shifted inexplicably between frames, shadows appeared inconsistent with the time of day, and some faces blurred in a manner not attributable to photographic error. These photographs were confiscated shortly after the journalist contacted the authorities, and the files were sealed for 27 years. Archival review in 1995 revealed that these images, once suppressed, corresponded to children listed as missing in the official orphanage records, providing the first tangible visual evidence of the disappearances. Analysis of the architectural plans from 1922 to 1970 reveals areas of the building previously unknown to the public: hidden corridors, locked rooms, and sub-level storage areas. Former staff recall these spaces vaguely, often claiming not to remember their existence or dismissing inquiries with evasive answers. In interviews conducted for this investigation, one former housekeeper stated, "There were rooms that smelled of damp wood and something else, something that made you not want to speak aloud." Correlating these recollections with the original blueprints uncovers an unsettling pattern: rooms connected in a labyrinthine manner, allowing movement and concealment within the building without detection from the main administrative areas. The diary entries of Whitmore, combined with photographic evidence, surviving correspondence, and testimonies, suggest a deliberate system designed to obscure the fates of certain children. While some disappearances may have been covered by legal placements, others remain unexplained, their final destinies unknown. This initial chapter of our investigation sets the stage for understanding St. Agatha Orphanage not merely as an institution of care, but as a complex mechanism of concealment, where bureaucracy, secrecy, and control intersected to produce a trail of missing children. The following chapters will examine the mid-century expansion of the orphanage, the psychological conditioning of its residents, and the eventual unraveling of its long-held secrets as survivors and investigators pieced together what had been hidden for decades. Archival documents, personal testimonies, and photographic evidence converge to suggest a pattern both systematic and chilling, and the story of St. Agatha Orphanage stands as a cautionary tale of how institutions designed to protect can under certain circumstances perpetuate harm with methodical precision. The shadows of its halls, the silent corridors, and the empty beds persist in the memories of those who survived, offering a haunting testament to lives lost and questions that remain unanswered even 73 years after the orphanage first opened its doors. By the early 1950s, St. Agatha Orphanage had entered its third decade of operation, a period marked by both continuity and intensifying mystery. The post-war years brought new challenges to the orphanage, as the social landscape of England shifted dramatically. A rising awareness of child welfare, coupled with stricter government oversight, began to illuminate aspects of the orphanage that had long remained obscured. Archival reports from this era detail routine inspections, yet each report is conspicuously vague regarding the whereabouts of numerous children. One official memorandum, dated March 1952, notes that 22 children were unaccounted for, but adds, in parentheses, placement records incomplete, presumed relocated or adopted. What is striking about these documents is the frequency with which missing children are dismissed in bureaucratic language, as if absence were a routine administrative error rather than a potential tragedy. Former staff members interviewed decades later recall that the orphanage operated under a strict hierarchy, with the headmistress maintaining almost absolute authority. Margaret Whitmore, now in her 60s, is described by employees as both charismatic and terrifyingly precise, demanding absolute obedience and punishing any hint of insubordination. In one interview, a former cook recounted, "If a child asked too many questions or wandered where she shouldn't, they simply vanished. No one spoke of it, not even us." The nature of these vanishings remains unclear, but survivor accounts consistently describe children being escorted away in the dead of night, never to be seen again. Psychological conditioning was another critical feature of life at St. Agatha. Diaries and letters discovered in 1978 describe daily routines designed to instill fear and submission. Children were woken before dawn, required to complete exhaustive chores, and subject to strict dietary and behavioral regulations. Punishments were meted out publicly. Minor infractions led to isolation, deprivation, or beatings. Older children were often assigned to oversee younger ones, creating a system of internalized enforcement. In correspondence from 1954, Whitmore writes, "The eyes of the children must always see the order maintained. Disorder allowed is weakness." This statement, clinical and chilling, illuminates a philosophy in which the institution itself superseded individual well-being. The 1950s also brought a series of unexplained deaths among the residents. Medical records, incomplete and sometimes deliberately falsified, list causes ranging from illness to accidents, yet interviews with surviving staff suggest that these events were neither fully accidental nor inevitable. One nurse, speaking anonymously in 1976, recalled tending to a boy who had sustained severe head injuries, only to be told by Whitmore, "He fell where he was meant to." The phrasing, innocuous to an outsider, hints at deliberate harm sanctioned from the highest authority. Archival photographs from the period, taken ostensibly for inspection purposes, reveal disturbing patterns. In some images, children are positioned unnaturally. Shadows fall inconsistently, and certain faces appear blurred or missing entirely. When juxtaposed with official rosters, several of these children correspond to names later listed as missing or deceased. Such inconsistencies suggest a level of manipulation in both physical presentation and record-keeping, reinforcing the notion that the orphanage maintained meticulous control over perception and documentation. By the mid-1960s, the orphanage had come under sporadic media scrutiny. Local newspapers published minor exposés about harsh conditions and unexplained absences, though the stories were brief and largely sympathetic to Whitmore's narrative of benevolent care. Attempts by investigative journalists to access records were often thwarted by bureaucratic obstacles or staff unwilling to cooperate, citing confidentiality or loyalty to the institution. In 1967, an internal government report described the orphanage as not immediately threatening but warranting careful observation, a phrase that effectively curtailed active investigation while allowing operations to continue largely unimpeded. One remarkable source of insight into this period comes from letters exchanged between Whitmore and a longtime supporter of the orphanage, a Mr. Edward Langley, a local magistrate. In these letters, written between 1960 and 1965, Whitmore details administrative decisions with an unsettling candor. She describes transferring certain children to distant homes without notification, justifying these moves as necessary for maintaining the integrity of the orphanage. Her language suggests that disappearance was sometimes deliberate, framed as a means of control rather than a tragic accident. Oral histories collected from former residents paint a vivid picture of life during the orphanage's mid-century period. Children recount experiences of constant surveillance, punitive routines, and a pervasive atmosphere of fear. In one testimony, A woman who lived at St. Agatha in the early 1950s recalls a friend, a boy named Peter, who vanished overnight after questioning a staff member about the whereabouts of another child. She remembers the subsequent cover-up. "They told me he had gone to a new home, but I just knew, that he would never come back." Such narratives, corroborated across multiple independent accounts, reveal a systemic pattern of disappearances intertwined with psychological intimidation. The orphanage also imposed strict control over communication with the outside world. Letters to and from relatives were censored or intercepted, and children were often discouraged from mentioning prior family connections. Government reports note that correspondence was irregular and poorly catalogued, raising questions about oversight and accountability. Between 1965 and 1970, under the leadership of a new administrator following Whitmore's retirement, the orphanage experienced minor reforms. Some children were permitted increased freedom of movement and access to external schooling. However, archival interviews indicate that the legacy of Whitmore's strict regime persisted. Older children, trained in obedience and secrecy, maintained the culture of silence, passing down methods of evasion and concealment to younger cohorts. The psychological imprint of decades of structured fear created a self-perpetuating system in which disappearances could continue with minimal scrutiny. Perhaps the most compelling evidence of the orphanage's secretive practices during this era emerges from a set of investigative files recovered in 1995. These files, long thought destroyed, contain testimony from former residents who were adults by the late 1970s. They describe hidden chambers, unmarked rooms, and passages known only to staff. One individual recalls discovering a sub-level storage area during a rare moment of unsupervised exploration, finding remnants of children's belongings and a ledger with names corresponding to those officially listed as missing. The combination of physical concealment, strict hierarchies, and psychological conditioning created an environment in which disappearances could occur with minimal detection. The question remains: how many children were truly lost to the orphanage, and how many were obscured by bureaucratic manipulation, reassignments, or adoption arrangements designed to appear legitimate? By 1975, the institution's decline became more apparent. Media attention, coupled with government reviews, led to renewed scrutiny. Former staff and residents began speaking out, though many accounts were fragmented, inconsistent, or suppressed. Despite this, patterns of behavior emerged. Children reported being moved at night, punished for questioning authority, and witnessing the sudden absence of peers with no explanation. The mid-century chapter of St. Agatha Orphanage, therefore, is defined by a tension between external oversight and internal concealment. The building's walls, once a symbol of protection, became instruments of control. Bureaucratic language, psychological conditioning, and carefully managed records allowed the institution to persist, even as the toll on children's lives and psyches remained obscured. As this investigation moves into the final decades of the orphanage, the narrative will focus on the unraveling of these systems, the testimonies of survivors, and the eventual exposure of practices long hidden. The mid-century period serves as a critical lens, revealing how institutions can manipulate perception, evade accountability, and perpetuate harm under the guise of care. Through a careful reconstruction of archival documents, photographs, personal testimonies, and government reports, the story of St. Agatha Orphanage emerges as one of systemic secrecy and chilling efficiency, a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities of children in the care of those entrusted with their safety. The events between 1950 and 1975 form the backbone of understanding the orphanage's inner mechanisms, laying the groundwork for the final chapter in which the dissolution of the institution and the testimonies of survivors bring the full scope of its dark legacy into view. By the late 1970s, St. Agatha Orphanage had become a subject of persistent inquiry and growing public concern. Reports of disappearances, once sporadic and largely dismissed, had accumulated over decades, creating a pattern that could no longer be ignored. government agencies, journalists, and former residents began to piece together a mosaic of events that revealed the full extent of the institution's hidden practices. In 1976, a comprehensive inquiry was initiated by the Ministry of Social Services, prompted by letters from former residents and a series of investigative articles in national newspapers. Inspectors were granted unprecedented access to the orphanage's records, blueprints, and remaining staff. What they discovered was a labyrinthine network of corridors, locked rooms, and sub-level chambers that had long been hidden from official view. Among the recovered documents were personal diaries of children, written in secret during the 1960s and early 1970s, recounting episodes of punishment, isolation, and forced silence. One diary, authored by a girl named Helen Cray, describes a ritualized nightly roll call in which children were required to account for one another's whereabouts. Those who could not provide satisfactory answers were reportedly confined to hidden rooms for extended periods, sometimes disappearing entirely from the institution's official records. Interviews conducted with former staff and administrators painted a grim portrait of systematic control and concealment. Several employees admitted to participating in practices designed to obscure the fates of certain children. One long-serving housekeeper, speaking anonymously, recalled being instructed to falsify logs and remove records from filing cabinets. "I knew it was deemed right, but if we questioned her, we were told we could leave. And some did. They never came back." Investigators cross-referenced these testimonies with archival photographs and administrative files, uncovering inconsistencies that suggested deliberate obfuscation. Between 1922 and 1978, at least 70 children could not be accounted for, their names appearing in some records and disappearing in others. The final decade of St. Agatha's operation was marked by increasing scrutiny. In 1974, a former resident brought forward a series of photographs depicting children lined up in the orphanage's courtyard, some of whom were later confirmed missing. Shadows and blurs in the images suggested that manipulation or concealment had occurred even during official documentation. These photographs, combined with recovered blueprints and first-hand accounts, allowed investigators to reconstruct areas of the building previously unknown: hidden stairwells, false walls, and storage areas repurposed as makeshift isolation rooms. Psychologists consulted during the inquiry noted that the psychological impact on surviving residents was profound. Many described symptoms consistent with long-term trauma, anxiety, hypervigilance, and a pervasive sense of danger even in adulthood. Testimonies recounting the sudden disappearance of friends, the enforced silence, and the fear of punishment all pointed to an environment of sustained psychological manipulation. The culmination of these findings led to a series of legal proceedings in 1978. Former staff were interrogated, though the passage of time, loss of records, and deaths of key personnel limited prosecutorial success. Whitmore, by then in her 70s, declined to testify, citing ill health, and no criminal convictions were ultimately secured. However, the inquiry produced an extensive public report detailing systemic failures in oversight, record-keeping, and child welfare practices. This report, along with recovered diaries, photographs, and blueprints, forms the foundation of contemporary understanding of the orphanage's operations. One of the most striking discoveries of the final investigation was the network of sub-level rooms that had been used to confine children without official acknowledgement. Investigators noted that these rooms were equipped minimally, with only basic bedding and little ventilation, suggesting deliberate neglect. Former residents confirmed that children placed in these areas were rarely seen again, reinforcing the theory that a combination of physical concealment and bureaucratic manipulation had enabled decades of disappearances. Oral histories from survivors reveal a pattern of enforced obedience, secrecy, and mutual surveillance among children themselves. Older residents were often coerced into monitoring younger ones, perpetuating the culture of control. Many survivors describe carrying the trauma of these experiences into adulthood, struggling to reconcile their memories with the sparse and often misleading records maintained by the orphanage. Archival evidence also uncovered correspondence between Whitmore and external supporters, detailing strategies to mitigate scrutiny and maintain the orphanage's reputation. These documents illustrate a deliberate effort to frame disappearances as placements or adoptions, masking the underlying reality from both government oversight and public attention. Despite the absence of criminal convictions, the exposure of these practices in 1978 marked a turning point. The orphanage was closed, and surviving residents were relocated to foster care or other institutional settings. Investigators emphasized that while some children had indeed been placed in legitimate homes, the scale of unaccounted-for individuals highlighted systemic abuse and concealment spanning over 5 decades. In the years following closure, former residents formed support networks, sharing memories, photographs, and personal accounts to reconstruct their histories. These collective efforts have allowed a more comprehensive understanding of St. Agatha Orphanage's impact on the children it housed. The institution, once shrouded in secrecy and bureaucratic language, has been transformed into a case study in the consequences of unchecked authority and institutional opacity. Contemporary analysis draws lessons not only from the disappearances themselves, but also from the mechanisms that allowed them to occur: strict hierarchies, psychological manipulation, and the deliberate obfuscation of records. Today, the legacy of St. Agatha Orphanage is preserved through archives, survivor testimonies, and investigative reports, serving as a sobering reminder of the vulnerabilities inherent in institutions entrusted with care. The final chapter of this investigation highlights not only the scale of what was hidden, but also the resilience of those who survived. Their testimonies, photographs, and recovered documents collectively illuminate the human cost of systemic control and secrecy. By examining the orphanage from its inception to its closure in 1978, we gain insight into the complex interplay between authority, oversight, and human vulnerability. The story of St. Agatha Orphanage is both a historical account and a cautionary tale, revealing how institutional structures, when left unchecked, can facilitate harm on a scale difficult to fully comprehend. As our investigation concludes, the full weight of decades-long secrecy, disappearance, and psychological impact emerges, underscoring the enduring significance of transparency, accountability, and the protection of those most vulnerable within any society. The shadow of St. Agatha lingers not in brick or mortar, but in the memories, testimonies, and historical records that persist, ensuring that the lives lost concealed or traumatized are not forgotten, and that the lessons of oversight and vigilance continue to inform modern child welfare practices.